Well, good evening. As some of you know, I'm a lawyer, and I was asked by a bishop to give a talk one time about the trial of Christ from a lawyer's standpoint. As the bishop was asking me to do that, his counselor, Brother Pugh, was standing nearby, and Brother Pugh said, "But Bishop, don't you recall that Christ himself said, 'Woe unto you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge'?" I asked Brother Pugh if he remembered that the man who had taken Jesus' body down from the cross and prepared it for burial and placed it in his own tomb was Joseph of Arimathea. Yes, he remembered that, so I asked him if he remembered that Joseph was a lawyer. No, he hadn't realized that, and so I was beginning to feel a little bit of pride in the legal profession, when Brother Pugh said, "Well, he probably just did that hoping he would get to handle the estate." Anyway, I'm here not to take away the key of knowledge, but to discuss some of the illegalities involved in the trials that Christ went through in the last week of his mortal ministry. The Book of Mormon tells us why Christ was crucified. In 2 Nephi, it says, "But because of priestcrafts and iniquities, they at Jerusalem will stiffen their necks against him that he be crucified." And then priestcrafts were defined in the Book of Mormon as, "Behold, priestcrafts are that men preach and set themselves up for a light unto the world, that they may get gain and praise of the world, but they seek not the welfare of Zion." Well, to get some background into the trials of Christ, we need to look at what was happening at the time of those trials, to have some of the history of the political climate and the people that were involved in those trials. Now, the Romans had conquered the Jews, and Palestine had become what is known as a client state. Judea was ruled by Rome through a Roman procurator. A procurator is a representative, a personal representative of Caesar, someone to act in his stead since he couldn't be there. The Roman leaders at that time were, first of all, Julius Caesar, who had ruled the Roman Empire until 31 BC, 31 years before Christ. And then his great-nephew, Augustus Caesar, became the heir to Julius Caesar upon his assassination. Augustus ruled from approximately 31 BC to 14 AD, so he was the emperor at the time of Christ's birth. He established the empire and built roads and aqueducts and did much to improve the empire temporally. By 4 AD, both of Augustus's grandsons and heirs to his position had died. So Augustus made his stepson, Tiberius Claudius Nero, best known as Tiberius Caesar, made him into his heir and his successor. So Tiberius ruled from Augustus' death in 14 AD to about 37 AD. So he was the ruler of the Roman Empire at the time of Christ's trial. Now, the Emperor Augustus had actually forced Tiberius to divorce his wife, while Augustus was still alive, of course, to divorce his wife and marry his own stepsister, Julia. But Julia and Tiberius were unhappy being married together, so Tiberius had actually left her and went to live on the island of Rhodes until he was later recalled to Rome by Augustus at the time Augustus named him to become the heir and his successor to the throne. Now, Julia was the daughter of Augustus Caesar. She was a woman of the most reckless habits. In fact, her father, Augustus Caesar, was so ashamed of the conduct of his daughter that he even threatened her death. He exiled her from the kingdom at one point. Well, Augustus had first married her off to a man named Marcellus, and that didn't work, so he married her off to a man by the name of Marcus Agrippa. That also didn't work. So that's when he recalled Tiberius from the island of Rhodes and required Tiberius to marry Julia. And of course they didn't work out very well either, but in spite of those matches, Julia's debaucheries became so notorious that Augustus was compelled to banish her from Rome. And because of this, Augustus actually avoided all company for a period of time and considered putting Julia to death. Well, Tiberius was a good administrator. He carefully supervised the collection of the taxes of the empire. He balanced the budget, unlike some of our current leaders, and chose efficient governors to rule throughout the Roman Empire in the various places. Tiberius, though, was paranoid. He was worried about somebody taking over his power and control. He had at least 52 men put to death because of suspicions that they were conspiring to take over the empire. One of those was a man by the name of Germanicus, who was the probable successor to Tiberius in the control of the empire. Well, those are the rulers of Rome itself. We have another character that enters into this story by the name of Pontius Pilate. He was the one who was the procurator at Judea at the time of Christ's trials. Now that again is the political substitute of Caesar in that far reach of the empire. Pontius Pilate was born in Seville, Spain, and he was actually a renegade to Spain. When Spain was conquered by Rome, he had switched over to the Roman side instead of staying on this side of Spain. After Spain had been conquered, Pilate went to Rome then to seek his fortune. He happened to marry a girl by the name of Claudia. Claudia was the youngest daughter of Julia. You remember Julia was the daughter of Augustus, the one that had married Tiberius. So here is Pontius Pilate now marrying Claudia, the daughter of Julia and the stepdaughter of Tiberius. Well, they were married when Claudia was only 15 years of age. And Pilate actually married Claudia in hopes of an imperial appointment of some sort. That was how he sought his fortune. Well, as a wedding gift, Tiberius did present Pilate with a commission as the procurator of Judea. Now, if you look on the map, and in the back of the Bible, there's map 13, which shows the Roman Empire at the time of Christ's life. And it shows that Rome is in one part of that map, and Judea was all the way over across the Mediterranean Sea at the other end of the empire. And that's the idea. Tiberius wanted to get Pilate and his stepdaughter as far away as possible. So that was the wedding gift. At that time, the prior procurators had been very careful in not offending the Jewish nation. They were a nation that was subject to the Roman rule, but they had been given the authority to rule in their own matters. But Pilate took over that position, entered Jerusalem with standards which were emblazoned with the images of Tiberius. Well, this offended the Jews, and they demonstrated and asked that he remove those statues and figures of Tiberius. And Pilate surrounded the demonstrators with soldiers and ordered them to disband or they would be put to death. Well, they laid on the ground and bared their necks asking to be put to death rather than submit to that kind of sacrilege. They wouldn't see their holy city defiled with the worldly images. That, of course, was their second commandment, to have no graven image. Well, Pilate yielded and withdrew the standard. So his first act as procurator in Judea was a blunder which embarrassed all the subsequent career. On another occasion, Pilate appropriated some of the temple funds to have an aqueduct built to bring the waters into Jerusalem. Well, of course, the Jews had a reverence for the korban, or the temple money as it was called, which was appropriated to perform that function. And they were again offended that this temple fund was used for such a worldly purpose. It was not meant for that kind of a purpose. Well, so Pilate learned there would be another objection and a demonstration, a request for reconsideration of this action. He caused his soldiers to mingle in with the Jewish crowd who were going to demonstrate, and on his signal, the soldiers drew their weapons and cut down and beat up great numbers of this helpless crowd and slaughtered many of those that were in the crowd in order to crush the opposition to the building of this aqueduct. Well, this again stirred up hatred in the hearts of the Jewish subjects towards Pilate. Pilate also adorned the palace in which he resided at Jerusalem with shields which were dedicated to Tiberius, again offending the Jewish people. This time they petitioned directly to Tiberius in Rome and asked that he intercede and have something done. Well, Tiberius sided with them, and because the Jewish people had said this was done less for the honor of Tiberius than for the annoyance of the Jewish people. And so Tiberius asked that these emblems again be removed from the palace there in Jerusalem. Pilate, you'll have to remember, was an extension of Tiberius, and as such did not want to displease him. Pilate was a wicked and immoral man, but he was also a coward who hated the Jews, and so had to be very careful with his position. Another player in our cast of characters at this time was a man by the name of Herod the Great. His name was Herod. He took upon himself the words the Great. He was appointed by his friend Augustus, who was then the emperor, to become the king of Judea. Now, Judea was the conquered nation, but they were allowed to govern themselves somewhat internally. And so a king could be appointed to do that governing. So Herod was appointed the king. Herod was also a convert to Judaism, so he had power as an appointee of Rome, but also power as a Jewish citizen. He was the one that had all the children in Bethlehem and all the coast thereof put to death at the time of the birth of Christ. Gives you an idea of the kind of character that he was. Well, Herod left a will at his death which divided his kingdom among his sons. Now that could not be carried out without the approval of Rome, but after a long delay, Rome approved and confirmed the last will, which left his kingdom divided into three portions. One went to Archelaus, that was the area of Judea and Samaria. Philip received Galantis and Batanea, and Herod Antipas received the areas of Galilee and Perea. Herod Antipas is our next player. Now he's the one that received the title of the Tetrarch of Galilee from his father through this will, which was approved by Rome at the death of Herod the Great. The title of Tetrarch is a title used when the part that is governed is some fraction of the whole. So it was just a division of the actual kingdom that Herod governed. On the death of Herod's brother Archelaus, Herod thought that the kingdom should be consolidated again, and Herod should then be allowed to govern not only Galilee, but also the part that had been given to Archelaus. That included Judea. But instead of that happening, Pontius Pilate, who had now married Claudia, was given the area of Judea as his wedding gift. This may have been the cause of the trouble between Pilate and Herod. Remember how that's commented on in the Bible. Well, Herod Antipas is also the one that had John the Baptist beheaded, and there is some reference to him by Christ where the Pharisees told Christ that Herod would have him put to death. Christ said, "Go ye and tell that fox, behold, I cast out devils, and I do cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected." This he spake, signifying his death. That's his reference to Herod. He called him the fox. Now Herod seems to have been a perpetual drunkard and morally bankrupt. Because of his position, Herod had some control from Rome and also of the Jewish nation. At this time, the Jewish nation was a client state. They were conquered by Rome, but they were allowed to govern their own people as long as it didn't interfere with Roman law. Roman law was still considered supreme. Now, the Jewish nation was governed by the great Sanhedrin. That name, Sanhedrin, the translation of that denotes a legislative assembly or ecclesiastical council which is deliberating in a sitting posture. That's what Sanhedrin means. The great Sanhedrin was patterned after Moses' revealed council of the 70 from 1500 years earlier. It had been a tradition that had been handed down. It was made up of 71 members. There were 23 chief priests who were religious in nature, the priestly function, 23 scribes who were actually the lawyers, learned in the law, and 23 elders. Those were the patriarchal or the more popular people that were chosen to sit on this council. And then there was one father of the tribunal who acted somewhat like a vice president as we would know him today. And then the 71st person is the chief high priest or the president of the council. A quorum of at least 23 was required to conduct the business of that Sanhedrin. Only the great Sanhedrin had jurisdiction to hear cases in which a death penalty could be imposed. Members of the Sanhedrin had to meet all the qualifications to become judges. There were actually several lower courts. In addition to the Great Sanhedrin, there was what was called a minor or lesser Sanhedrin, which was located in towns with about 120 or more families. They each had their own local court called a lesser Sanhedrin. They could hear nearly all cases except for capital offenses. And this lower Sanhedrin was made up of only 23 members. They also had to meet these same requirements for qualification. We'll talk about those in a minute. In addition to the minor Sanhedrin, there was a lower tribunal or a local court, which was made up of 3 judges. There were no courts with only 1 judge. The smallest court had 3 judges, and one was chosen by an accuser, one was chosen by the defendant, and those 2 then chose a 3rd judge to sit in the judgment. Now these lower courts could only hear matters of small importance, and they were held in the open air under the trees or by a city gate. The qualifications to become a member of the Great Sanhedrin included some of the following. First of all, they had to have been of lineal descent from Hebrew parents. They must have been learned in the law, both written and unwritten law. They must have judicial experience. What that means is they had to have already filled offices of increasing dignity, beginning with the local courts and passing through the greater courts, the higher Sanhedrins, until they could be called to sit in the Great Sanhedrin. They must be thoroughly proficient in scientific knowledge. The scientific knowledge of that time included, of course, astronomy and medicine and even chemistry, as much as it had advanced in those days. Members of the court had to be learned in all of those areas. They all had to be accomplished linguists. Interpreters were not allowed in the Hebrew courts, so the members of the Sanhedrin had to know all of the surrounding languages so that they would be able to understand all of the witnesses. A member of the Sanhedrin should be popular, but modest and of good appearance and free from haughtiness. A good appearance was considered a natural result from learning and dignity, and every judge had to possess that. Also, the judge, a member of the Sanhedrin, had to be pious, strong, and courageous to show that they would make righteous and just decisions. Now, disqualifications for the Sanhedrin were as follows. A man who never had held any trade or profession was disqualified. In trials where a death penalty would be inflicted, an aged man or a person who never had any children of his own or an illegitimate son were disqualified to be judges. Also, no one was eligible to become a member of the Sanhedrin until he had reached at least the age of 40. That gave them a little more wisdom. Disqualified people were also gamblers, dice players, bettors on pigeon matches, usurers, and slave dealers. These activities were regarded as forms of thievery, and thieves, of course, were not eligible to sit as judges. Also, a man who had dealt in the fruits of the 7th year was disqualified. Under the law of Moses, it was stated that you were allowed to grow your crops for 6 years and harvest those crops. But on the 7th year, you were to leave the land fallow and not harvest. And so a person who had still grown crops and dealt in them was considered to have no conscience and was therefore disqualified. In addition to that, a man who had been concerned with or was interested in a matter to be adjudicated was disqualified. How could someone personally interested in a matter be unselfish and impartial in making a judgment? All relatives of the accused, whatever degree of relation, were disqualified. And a person who would be an heir or would otherwise benefit from the outcome of the trial or from the death of the defendant was also disqualified. And in no event could the king be a member of the Sanhedrin. So King Herod never could join the Sanhedrin. The chief high priest was the most powerful Jewish leader. He was the chief judge of the great Sanhedrin. He was the leader of the governing body of the Jewish nation. At the time of the trial of Christ, the house of Hanan was the most powerful family in the Jewish nation. Annas was the patriarch of that family. Annas had been the chief high priest from about 7 AD to 15 AD. So he was probably the chief high priest that was sitting in the temple at the time that Christ came to the temple as a youth and taught the priests in the temple. Annas was corrupt and had been removed from office by Rome for carrying out a death sentence without the proper approval of the Roman authorities. He was followed in the office of high priest by 5 of his own sons and his son-in-law, Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time of the trial of Christ. Now the house of Hanan, Annas being the patriarch, operated what were called the 4 shops under the twin cedars of Olivet, which were the shops that sold the sacrificial animals at the temple. The doves went for 1 gold coin apiece. And Caiaphas was one of those who managed those shops and was, of course, the ruling high priest. Well, under Hebrew law, there were certain rules of procedures. Let me quickly go through some of those, and you'll note how important they were at the time of the trial of Christ. Number 1, proceedings must be held during the day. The proceedings would begin after a morning sacrifice at the temple. The members of the Sanhedrin would gather together, make their morning sacrifice before they met in council to hold a court session. The proceedings had to be held in what was called the chamber of hewn stones, which was a room on the temple grounds. Capital offenses could only be heard by the great Sanhedrin, but the Sanhedrin could no longer carry out capital punishment without Roman approval. At least 23 members of the great Sanhedrin were required to form a quorum. Speeches by the judges were recorded both in favor of and against any accused, and then voting on the charges began with the youngest member, so that the youngest wouldn't be influenced by the opinion of the older members of the Sanhedrin in making their decision. Prejudiced judges could not participate in a trial. No proceedings were to be held on a Sabbath day, a feast day, or on the evening of a Sabbath or a feast day, because if a death sentence was pronounced, a second trial had to be held on the following day. If there were 2 trials, the judges were to fast and pray in between the 2 trials. The members of the Sanhedrin may not originate any charges or be an accusing witness. On the second day of a trial, a judge could change his vote from guilty to not guilty, but not the other way around. The rules of the witnesses and evidence had to be followed. A unanimous verdict under Hebrew law had the same effect as an acquittal. It was considered if the vote were unanimous, that meant that everyone was prejudiced against the defendant and there was nobody speaking on his behalf, so the acquittal was rendered. The priests were not allowed to rend their clothes. That was a sign of grievous action being taken, so that was not allowed in the trial. And then the merits of any defense had to be heard. The rules relating to the witnesses and the evidence included the competency of witnesses. To be a competent witness, you had to be worthy almost to be a judge. It was that strict. The following persons were considered incompetent and could not be witnesses: Gentiles, minors, slaves, idiots and lunatics, deaf, mutes, blind men, gamblers, usurers, illiterate or immodest persons, persons who had been convicted of irreligion or immorality, relatives of the accused, tax gatherers, persons directly interested in the case, and women could not be witnesses. Now, it wasn't because the Hebrews were antagonistic to women or thought of them as second-class citizens, but under Hebrew law, when a death sentence was pronounced, the sentence was actually carried out by the accusing witness. And so if the woman were the accusing witness and death by stoning was the sentence, the woman would be the one that would carry out that sentence. Well, the Jewish people didn't want their women having to go through that, so they just didn't allow women to even be witnesses. Under Hebrew law, at least 2 witnesses were required to convict an accused person. The prosecuting witness being included, there had to be 3 witnesses. The witnesses also had to agree in all of the essential details. In all of the essential details. If not, their testimony was considered invalid and had to be rejected. There was never any oath required. They had a procedure called the prior examination of witnesses. As a caution against the admission of irrelevant testimony, the witnesses were first questioned by a couple of the members of the Sanhedrin who were appointed as a committee for that purpose. These committee members weeded out any irrelevant testimony, and it was never then presented to the whole council. There had to be a separation of any witnesses. The witness was not allowed to be in the presence of any other testifying witness, and so they had to agree without having heard what the other one said. The witness was always asked questions relating to the time and the place of the alleged crime, and those questions could not be varied. They always had to be asked. And then questions regarding the circumstances and facts surrounding the case were also asked. Under Hebrew law, any false witness who was found to be a false witness would have to suffer the same penalty that the accused person would have suffered if he were found to have been guilty. So if you gave any false testimony and were found out and a death sentence was imposed, then you were going to be subject to that death sentence as a false witness. Now, the accused was never compelled to testify against himself, much like our Fifth Amendment right not to be a witness against yourself. But the accused was permitted and even encouraged to offer any testimony on his own behalf. But a confession by the accused was not accepted solely. It had to be corroborated with other witnesses to find that person guilty. It could never, standing alone, form the basis of a conviction. Hearsay evidence and circumstantial evidence were always considered irrelevant. And there was an interesting point of law called an antecedent warning that had to be given. A person who was charged with a crime involving life and death had to have been warned immediately before the commission of the crime that what he was about to do was a crime and that a death penalty was attached to committing that kind of a crime. This warning was not considered effective if there were any time that lapsed in between the giving of the warning and the commission of the crime. And it was also of no force unless the criminal had acknowledged receiving that warning. It was an interesting little quirk in the law. Okay, now we need to go to some of the events that occurred in the last week of Christ's mortal ministry and see how these rules and laws and these historical events relate to the happenings in that last week. The antagonism of Christ's enemies had already become great. You'll remember that when Lazarus died, Mary and Martha sent a message of that death to Jesus. Jesus tarried 2 days before he even began the journey back to Judea. And the disciples even at that time objected to his returning to Judea because the Jews had sought to stone him already, and so they warned him against going back. But Christ returned to Bethany, raised Lazarus from the dead after he had been in the tomb for 4 days. Now that event was witnessed by many people. The scriptures say, after that event, the raising of Lazarus, then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council. Well, that meant there had to be at least a quorum of 23. And they said, "What do we? For this man doeth many miracles. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. We won't be the governing body any longer." And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, "Ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people," one man being Christ, "that the whole nation perish not. And this spake he not of himself, but being the high priest that year. And he prophesied that Jesus should die for their nation. Then from that day forth they took counsel together to put Christ to death." So Jesus taught no more openly among the Jews, and he led his disciples to a little town of Ephraim, which is about 20 miles outside of Jerusalem. and taught them. And as the feast of the Passover approached, the leaders of the Sanhedrin wondered if Christ would come to Jerusalem again. In fact, they gave a warning or announced that if anyone knew of Christ's whereabouts, they were to inform them so that they could arrest him. Now, Christ had been teaching his disciples that he must go back to Jerusalem and suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be slain and rise again after 3 days. This he had already been teaching them. And as the feast of the Passover approached, Christ surprised his apostles by saying, "Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and all things which are written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man shall be accomplished." And he told them that he would be delivered to the chief priests. They would condemn him to death. They would deliver him to the Gentiles. The Gentiles will mock him and treat him spitefully, spit upon him, scourge him, and crucify him, and put him to death, and the third day he should rise again. But they did not yet understand these things. They didn't believe that was possible. As the feast days approached, Christ decided to go back to Jerusalem. And on Friday, which we would know now as March 31st of the year 34 A.D., according to James Talmage in Jesus the Christ and also Bruce McConkie in The Mortal Messiah, that date Christ arrived back in Bethany in the late afternoon and lodged with Mary, Martha, and with Lazarus, who he had raised from the dead. Well, Saturday, we don't know much about what happened. In fact, the gospel writers drew a reverential veil over that day. Presumably he spent it in worship of his Father and teaching the 12 things that they should be aware of for after his death. But then Saturday evening they had supper in the house of Simon the leper, and at that supper Mary anointed Christ with that costly ointment. And you'll remember that Judas Iscariot objected strongly to that, saying that the money could be better used. Christ reprimanded him and said that Mary had chosen a good thing to do. From that time, Judas went to the chief priests and said unto them, "What will you give me if I deliver Christ to you?" And they covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. And from that time he sought an opportunity to betray Christ. Then on Sunday we have the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where Christ was called the Son of David, which was a title which was reserved for the Messiah or the Savior. The multitude now recognized him. The chief priest admonished him and said that he shouldn't allow that to happen. Christ then went back to Bethany, and on Monday returned again. On that day he cleansed the temple again for the second time, drove out the money changers, overturned the seats of those that sold doves. Now you'll notice that this then showed an economic impact on the members of the house of Hanan. Remember, they were the ones who sold the doves in the temple, the sacrificial animals. So now Christ is not becoming only a political enemy, but also an economic threat to the leaders of the Sanhedrin. Several other things happened during that week, and then finally on Thursday, the day that we now would call April the 6th, Christ met with his apostles in that upper room for the Last Supper. The apostles were made clean as Jesus washed their feet. Now this was common for a servant to do, because in the days of Christ people would walk through the dusty roads and their feet would be dirty, so when they entered into a house the servant would usually wash their feet and clean them up. Well, Peter objected to that, of course, until he was told that he could have no part of the Lord without that washing, so Peter wanted to get washed all over. And then Christ instituted the ordinance of the sacrament and told of his betrayal by one of the apostles, and all of them wondered who that was going to be, and asked, "Is it I?" And Peter finally leaned over to John, who was sitting next to Christ, and said, "You're closest, ask him, who is that going to be?" So John asked Christ. Christ said, "It's the one that I passed the bread to after I've dipped it in the gravy." And he dipped his bread and passed it to Judas, who was sitting on the other side of him. And so John knew who it was. And Judas then asked Christ, "Master, is it I?" And Jesus answered him privately and said, "It is as thou hast said. Yes, it is you." And then he said, that thou doest, go and do quickly." Now here's interesting. It also says in the scriptures that he said, "But beware of innocent blood." Isn't this something akin to the antecedent warning that we just talked about? Warning him that he was about to betray innocent blood, which of course was the unpardonable sin. While Judas left the room, others assumed that he left to take care of some businesses, maybe pay for the meal or having something to do, because Judas was the money keeper, the keeper of the purse. John, in fact, called him a thief because apparently he'd done something wrong with the keeping of the money. Well, then, after they had sung a hymn, I wonder which hymn they chose, but anyway, afterwards Christ led the other 11 to the Mount of Olives, said a prayer in which one of the things he asked was that the Father protect those that he had given to Christ as the apostles, those 11 that were with him, protect them. And then he went with the 3, Peter, James, and John, into the Garden of Gethsemane, where he knelt and prayed fervently, was visited by an angel, and supported in the process where Christ said, "Let the cup pass from me. Nevertheless, thy will be done." And he took upon himself the sins of all the world, which caused his body to bleed at every pore. His agony in the garden is beyond our ability to comprehend. Somehow he paid for the sins of all mankind who will partake of that atoning sacrifice by repenting of those sins and accepting that atoning sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ.
This concludes the recording on this side of the cassette. You may continue the program by turning the cassette over.
Well, as you'll remember, Christ returned to the 3 who had chosen to go with him into the garden and found them sleeping 3 times. On the 3rd time he said, "Never mind, it is done, it is finished. I have completed what I came here to do." He had already performed that atoning sacrifice in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then he looked down the hill and saw the soldiers coming up the hill with their lighted torches. There was a Roman contingent together with the temple guard. That tells us that Pilate must have been approached to allow his soldiers to assist in making this arrest. So he was aware of what was going on. Judas then betrayed Christ with a kiss. One source translates this passage as Judas kissing Christ effusively all over the body, not just one kiss. Christ then walked towards the officers and asked, "Whom seek ye?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." He said, "I am he." But instead of advancing to take him, the crowd pressed backward, and many of them even fell to the ground. And then Christ said, "If you seek me, let these others go their way," that it might be fulfilled that he had earlier asked the Father for in that prayer, that they be protected. It's possible that if any of the other 11 had been arrested that night, they may not have been able to stand the torture and the humiliation of the next few hours. Their faith may have failed them. They were not yet prepared for that kind of an action. And so Peter then grabbed his sword, cut off the ear of Malchus, the temple guard. Christ admonished Peter and restored the ear to the temple guard and counseled the others to flee, and they left. And one of them writes he left his linen there and ran away naked. We think that was probably Mark, because he's the only one that wrote about that particular event. Well, from Gethsemane, the soldiers and the temple guard led Christ to the house of Annas. Annas, of course, had been the high priest. He was still the one that was the power behind the office, because his son-in-law Caiaphas was now the high priest. He was still the wealthiest and most powerful Jew in Jerusalem, and the most influential. The visit to Annas was unofficial in the strict sense, but it did assure the ultimate Roman penalty of death. Annas was possibly more at fault for Christ's death than anyone else. Remember how Christ said to Pilate, "He that delivered me unto thee has the greater sin." Well, Christ's second public cleansing of the temple had made him an economic threat to Annas, as well as others of the Sadducees, as well as just a religious threat, because of the sales of the sacrificial animals at the temple. Well, some of the illegalities that had already prevailed at the time of the arrest were as follows. The arrest was at night. This was against Hebrew law. It was based on the testimony of an accomplice, Judas. That was also a violation of Hebrew law. It could not be based upon such testimony. The arrest was made at night, and the accused was taken before Annas, who in an unofficial capacity was sitting as a sole judge, and of course was not allowed to sit as a sole judge. It was also at night at a residence, not at the place of a trial, the Temple of Hewn Stones. and no charge had yet been made against Christ. Also, Annas should have been disqualified anyway because he was not an impartial judge. He did have an economic interest in the outcome of the trial. Well, Christ knew of his rights, and so when he was questioned, he said, "I spoke openly in the temple. Ask the witnesses." Well, immediately he was smitten by one of the soldiers who stood nearby, and Christ said, "If I've said something out of order, tell me what I've done wrong. If I haven't done anything out of order, why do you strike me?" In other words, I know that under the law, a charge must be brought by an accusing witness. So I just asked you to go get a witness instead of asking me to testify against myself. What is wrong with that? Why do you hit me over something like that? Well, from Annas, Christ was then taken to the palace of Caiaphas. This was nearby, possibly even next door through a common courtyard, because in the transition, Christ saw or heard Peter make his denial as Christ had testified. Caiaphas, remembers, the one that earlier had said it is expedient that one man should die, that the nation perish not. So he was also not an impartial judge. They'd already made the decision to commit political murder, is what it amounted to. Well, the leading elders, scribes, and priests were already assembled, at least a quorum of 23, because they did counsel together. So they must have been alerted that Christ would be arrested that night. Well, they had to come up with some charge. So they sought a complaining witness now. Notice in the scriptures that they didn't just seek a witness, but Matthew says they sought false witnesses. Now, if someone were found to be a false witness, they would be subject to that same death penalty. But they sought false witnesses. But even then, the witnesses did not agree together as was required by law. One of them said he promised to destroy this temple and rebuild it, and the other one said something different than that. So the witnesses did not agree. All this time, Christ listened in silence. He had the right to remain silent, not to testify against himself. It is kind of interesting to note that if they had the proper witnesses, they may have found him guilty of blasphemy under Jewish law, except that Christ, of course, was the only one living at that time that could not have been found guilty of blasphemy, because he was indeed the Son of God. But he had been performing wonders in his own name. One of the characteristics of blasphemy under Jewish law was to not give due credit to Jehovah for any outstanding miracle that had been wrought. And in fact, this is what happened with Moses. When he struck the rock and produced water, he forgot to give credit to Jehovah and said, "Look what I have done." And so for that reason, he was prohibited from entering into the promised land. And so Christ did much the same thing in casting out devils and in raising Jairus' daughter and the son of the widow of Nain and feeding the thousands and other miracles that he had accomplished without giving due credit to Jehovah, although he was in fact Jehovah. So if prepared, the Sanhedrin could have called witnesses from those events and charged him with blasphemy. But they found that their witnesses did not agree, and so they didn't have a charge, and Jesus held his peace and answered nothing. And so the high priest, Caiaphas, said unto him, "I adjure thee, or I command thee, or charge thee under oath, by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God, the Son of the Blessed. Tell us this." And he said unto them, "If I will tell you, you will not believe. And if I also ask you anything, you will not answer me, nor let me go. Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of God and coming in the clouds of heaven." Well, that wasn't quite enough for them, so they all said, "Art thou then the Son of God?" And Jesus answered them, "Thou hast said that I am, and I am." So he did answer in the affirmative. He bore witness that he was the Son of God. The high priest then tore his cloak, a violation of the rules of procedure, and said, "He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses?" Well, what need did they have? Indeed, an accused could not be found guilty based upon his own confession. So they did have need of further witnesses. But Caiaphas said, "What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye?" And they answered and said, "What need we of any further witnesses? For we ourselves have heard of his own mouth." And they all condemned him to be guilty of death and said, he is worthy of death. A unanimous verdict. The immediate result of that should have been acquittal. He should have been turned free. Well, those who then held him mocked him, spit in his face, began to strike him, and asked him while they had him blindfolded to prophesy who it was that hit him. And the council adjourned and went their way. I'm sure they went out fasting and praying because they had to hold a trial on the following day. The next morning, as soon as it was light, immediately the chief priests came together and held a consultation with the elders and the scribes, and the whole council again condemned him to death. The whole multitude then arose and led him away to Pilate. The second meeting was, of course, that was required. Any person found guilty of a capital offense after a due trial should be given a second trial the following day. And at this later hearing, the judges could change their vote, reverse themselves, and find him not guilty. The illegalities that have so far happened are as follows. The arrest of Jesus took place in Gethsemane at night. There was a private examination of Jesus by Annas before the beginning of the regular trial. The indictment of Jesus was originated by the Sanhedrin instead of by a complaining witness. They tried Jesus at night. That was a violation of Hebrew law. It had to be held during the daytime. They tried him before the morning sacrifice had been offered. They tried him on the eve of a Jewish Sabbath, a Friday, the day before the Jewish Sabbath, and the beginning of the celebration of a Passover feast. Both of those occasions should have prohibited a trial, because the trial could not have been held on any of those days. They concluded the trial of Jesus within one day. Remember, under the Jewish law, a day started at sunset and went till sunset the next day. And so this was all concluded within one day instead of over 2 days as was required. They convicted Jesus on his uncorroborated confession. They convicted Jesus by a unanimous verdict. There were irregularities in the form of trying and convicting Jesus. First of all, the sentence of condemnation was pronounced in a place forbidden by law, not in the hall of hewn stone. The high priest rent his clothes. The balloting was irregular. It didn't go from the youngest to the oldest. They all condemned him to death, and the members of the Sanhedrin were disqualified to try him in the first place. They were most of them were interested in the outcome of the trial for economic reasons. And then last of all, the merits of the defense were not considered. Even though the great Sanhedrin did not consider the merits of the defense, I think it would be interesting to take a look at what points could be made on behalf of Jesus Christ if a defense had been presented on his behalf. So let's look at some of the ancient messianic prophecies that had been made to the Jewish nation to give background to his coming and see if he did meet some of those prophecies. First of all, it was prophesied that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. This was in Micah, and that was, of course, fulfilled at his birth. The Messiah was to be born of a virgin. He was to spring forth from the house of David. Mary, of course, was from the house of David. The Messiah should not come until the scepter had departed from Judah. Well, the Jewish nation was a conquered nation. It was subject to Rome. The scepter had departed. A forerunner like unto Elijah should come to prepare the way of the Messiah. John the Baptist was provided to prepare the way and was the one that baptized Jesus Christ. The Messiah was to begin preaching in Galilee, which is the place where he began his ministry. The Messiah should perform many miracles. Well, we know that this was fulfilled. He healed many, restored eyesight to the blind, provided food for the 5,000, and brought people back from the dead. Many miracles were performed. The Messiah was to make his public entry into Jerusalem riding upon an ass. This was prophesied by Zechariah and was fulfilled that very week of the trial as Christ entered into Jerusalem riding on the back of a colt. And this could be testified by many in the multitude who were there and witnessed that, as they called him their king and the Son of David, which was a term reserved for the Messiah. It was prophesied that the Messiah would be betrayed by one of his followers for 30 pieces of silver, which would finally be thrown into a potter's field. Again, this was in the book of Zechariah. This is interesting because it's quite symbolic. The Lord was paid for, so to speak, out of the temple money, which was destined for the purchase of sacrifices. The chief priest paid Judas for appointing the way out of the temple money, 30 pieces of silver. The temple money, again, had been reserved for the purchase of sacrifices. Christ was the ultimate sacrifice. The price for buying the legal freedom of a slave happened to be 30 pieces of silver. So with this purchase made through Judas, Christ purchased the freedom of all of us from this bondage of sin by performing that atonement. The 30 pieces of silver. Well, this of course was fulfilled through Judas Iscariot. Also it was prophesied that the Messiah would be a man of poverty and of suffering and would be despised and rejected of men. And this, of course, was the case. So these prophecies and many others had been fulfilled in the life of Jesus Christ. And those who were learned in the law, the members of the Sanhedrin, should have been very much aware of all of these prophecies and have been able to tell of their fulfillment. Now, if we were calling witnesses in defense of Jesus Christ, here are some we might list on our list of witnesses. First of all, Bartimaeus, who was a blind man who had been healed by Christ. Then the Roman centurion, whose servant was healed of the palsy. We might call the widow of Nain and her son, whom Christ raised from the dead. The ruler named Jairus and his daughter, whom Christ also raised from the dead. We may call hundreds of the deaf, dumb, blind, halt, lame, palsied, lepers, crippled, and diseased that he had healed. The more than 9,000 who were miraculously fed with a few loaves of bread and some fishes. That 9,000 did not include the wives and the children that were there. Lazarus may have been called, who had just been raised from the dead, and many who were there, including Mary and Martha, who witnessed this miracle. Christ's own mother Mary could have been called to testify how she gave birth as a virgin. The hundreds who were present at the baptism of Christ, when his Father said from the heavens, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Those who were present at the temple just a few days before, who heard the Father say in the temple, "I have glorified my name in my Son." Many were there who heard that. Some thought an angel spoke, others thought it was a thunder. But many heard the voice of the Father saying, "I have glorified my name." Peter, James, and John, who were with Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration, who also heard the Father say, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Malchus, the temple guard, whose ear was restored after it had been smitten off by Peter at the time of the arrest. Nicodemus, a member of the Sanhedrin, could have been called. He had openly defended Christ before the Sanhedrin on a previous occasion. It's probable that he was not among the members of the Sanhedrin that found Christ guilty. He may not have been a member of the quorum that was called together, because it was known that he would have again given a defense of Christ. Joseph of Arimathea may have been called. He was also a member of the Sanhedrin and had not taken part in the condemnation. He was the one who will subsequently take Christ's body and entomb it in his own tomb. And last of all, they should have listened carefully to Christ's own testimony, as he declared that he was indeed the Son of God. But instead they convicted the only person who could not be guilty of the charge of blasphemy. And then they led Jesus away to Pilate. Pilate was up. It was early in the morning, and sitting on his judgment seat, and the chief priests approached him and expected him just to condone their death penalty. But instead, Pilate asked them what the charge was against Christ. And they said, well, if he wasn't a sinner, we wouldn't have brought him to you. And Pilate said, well, then take him and try him according to your own law. And they said, well, it's unlawful for us to put a man to death, giving the indication that really they just wanted the stamp of approval. They didn't want to go through that whole process with Pilate. And so they knew that if they claimed that they found Christ guilty of blasphemy, this would have no meaning against a Roman ruler, because in Rome there was no such crime as blasphemy. In fact, the Roman leaders had a habit of declaring themselves a god upon their death so that they would be worshipped, and so the crime of blasphemy would not have been important to Pontius Pilate. So they had to bring a new charge, and they discussed it among themselves, and finally they said, we found this man perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ a king. Well, the first two of those charges didn't mean much to Pilate either, but when he learned that Christ claimed to be a king, that caused him some concern, and so he entered into the judgment hall where Christ was bound. Now the chief priests stayed outside of the judgment hall because, of course, this was the week of Passover, and if they entered into the home of a Gentile or the palace of Pilate, they would defile themselves. They wouldn't defile themselves by violating all the Jewish laws and finding Christ guilty of blasphemy, but they would if they entered into the home of a Gentile. And so they stayed outside. Pilate went in and asked Christ, art thou then a king? And Christ asked Pilate, are you asking me of yourself, or is it because others accuse me? In other words, are you asking me if I claim to be a king under Roman law, or is it because of the Jews saying that I am claiming to be a king? And Pilate said, well, I don't care anything about Jewish law. Are you a king? And so Christ knew that he only was concerned about Roman law. And he said, well, my kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate continued on and asked him, but art thou then a king? And he said, yes, I am, but my kingdom is not of the world. And so this did not cause Pilate any concern. He went out and told the chief priests, I find no fault in this man. Well, under Roman law now, this should have been the end of that Roman trial. That was a pronouncement. The Roman trial had three stages. There was first an accusation, a charge being made. Well, that was made by the chief priests when they indicated that he claimed to be a king. Then there was the interview by the Roman ruler, in this case Pilate. He went in and asked Christ if he indeed claimed to be a king. So that covered that part of it. And then the third part was the decision. Here it was rendered by Pilate, I find no fault in him. That should have been the end of the Roman trial, and Christ should have been let free. Well, of course, that caused a lot of consternation among the chief priests, and they began to stir up the people and said, Christ has been going about through Galilee, teaching various things and claiming to be a king. And Pilate focused in on the word Galilee and thought to himself, well, Herod is, of course, the tetrarch of Galilee. That's his part of the kingdom. Let's just send Christ over to Herod. He can take care of this. Get him out of my hair. And so he sent Christ bound to Herod. Now, Herod, of course, was the one who had ordered the beheading of John the Baptist. And at one time, Herod apparently had thought that Christ was a reincarnation or a resurrection or something of John the Baptist. And he was a little bit concerned. But these fears had apparently ceased by this time. But Herod was kind of interested in meeting Christ face to face. He'd heard about all these miracles, and he thought maybe he could get Christ to perform a miracle in sort of a circus atmosphere there in his court. But Christ said nothing. He answered nothing to the questioning. And so Herod wasn't concerned about him either, said he found no fault in him. He arrayed him in a gorgeous white robe, since he claimed to be a king, according to the Jewish leaders, and sent him back to Pilate. And so Pilate again faced a dilemma of what to do with Christ. It was a common practice at the Feast of the Passover for the Roman governor to release one of the prisoners to the people as a token of mercy at this feast. And so Pilate saw this as maybe a possible way out of putting Christ to death. Since he found no fault in Christ, he asked the people, the chief priests and the people that had gathered there at his palace, "It is now customary to release someone. Why don't I release Jesus as a token of mercy?" And the crowd shouted out. In fact, Pilate gave them a choice. He would either release Jesus or Barabbas, who was another prisoner that was being held. He'd been found guilty of sedition and murder in an insurrection that had occurred at Jerusalem. A wicked person who was awaiting his death sentence to be carried out. And so Pilate offered to release either Barabbas or Jesus. Well, the chief priests went among the crowd and caused them to call out for the release of Barabbas. Now, it's interesting that in Josephus and some of the other places, we're told that Barabbas had another name. Bar-Abbas also has a meaning. Abba is the word for father. Remember when Christ was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed, "Father, Abba, let this cup pass from me." Abba is a word for father. Bar means son of. And Josephus says Bar-Abbas had a first name, which was Jesus. So we have Jesus, son of the Father, being offered to the crowd, and also Jesus, the Son of God. So we have a counterfeit and a real Son of God. Quite a symbolic significance. And who did the crowd choose to have released? The counterfeit. They cried out for the release of Barabbas. Well, about this time, Pilate's wife, Claudia, came out and told Pilate to have nothing to do with this man, because she had dreamed in a dream that he was innocent and that Pilate should not have anything to do in putting him to death. And so Pilate again announced, "I find no fault in him." And then he tried to appease the crowd by saying, "Well, what if we take Christ down and scourge him and then release him? Won't that be all right? Just let him go. Maybe that will satisfy you." And they said, "No, crucify him, crucify him." At that time, Pilate performed two symbolic acts that should have freed Christ. One was the Gentile symbol. Pilate actually rose from the judgment seat, which indicated the end of the trial, that he had found no fault in him. This again should have caused the release of Christ. And then he called for a bowl of water and washed his hands. This was a Jewish symbol. Under Jewish law, if there was an unsolved murder, the priest could slay a heifer and wash their hands of his blood, and then the blood would not come upon them. And so this is the symbol that Pilate used, knowing that this was a Jewish symbol. He washed his hands and tried to free the prisoner. But the crowd cried out all the more, "Let him be crucified. Let his blood come upon us and upon all our nation." And so Pilate, because of all the past events, was afraid to exercise his authority as the Roman governor and set Christ free, because of all the trouble he had had. And so he sent him down for the scourging. After the scourging, he was brought forth again, and Pilate said, "Behold the man." And Pilate said unto them, "Take him and crucify him, because I find no fault in him." This is after he'd already washed his hands of this whole ordeal. And the Jews answered him and said, "We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." Well, this caused Pilate to be all the more afraid, and so he went back into the judgment hall and talked to Christ one more time. And he asked Christ some questions, and Christ didn't respond to him. And Pilate said, "Don't you know that I have the power to release you And then Christ answered, Thou couldst have no power against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. Pilate then sought the more to release him, but the crowd said, If thou let this man go, thou art no friend of Caesar. Whoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. So this caused Pilate to tremble in fear, because he knew he was a representative, a direct representative of Caesar. If he now let this man go, and the word gets back to Tiberius that Christ had claimed to be a king, this might be the end of Pilate himself. Remember, Tiberius was the one who had put 52 people to death because of a suggestion to him that they had wanted to take over his kingdom. Pilate pronounced the sentence, allowed the people to carry out the crucifixion. After he was nailed to the cross, Christ looked down and, speaking about the soldiers who had carried out their assignment, said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Then he spoke to the thieves that were placed on crosses next to him and said, Today thou shalt be with me in paradise. He looked down upon his mother, had compassion upon her as she witnessed the crucifixion, and asked John to take care of his mother. Even in this great moment of pain and agony, after going through Gethsemane and the trials of that he had to endure all that night long, and then being nailed to the cross and the scourging that had taken place, he still had compassion upon others. He then said, I thirst, and was offered some wine or vinegar. It's interesting to note that this wasn't as bad as it sounded, because in the Roman days they had a little Jewish relief society, in fact, that had a concoction of wine or vinegar with herbs in it that reduced the pain that they offered to people on the cross. This was offered to Christ at that time. He didn't accept that because he knew that he had to have his full faculties about him as he continued to perform his final sacrifice. And finally he said, My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Into thy hands I commend my spirit. It is finished. And he gave up the ghost. According to prophecy, no bones were to be broken. Now this was a common practice after the crucifixion, to make sure that a man who had been crucified had died. Before they took him down, they would break some bones, and if the man hadn't died yet, the shock would cause immediate death. They could tell that Christ had already died, and so the soldiers did not break his bones, but one soldier did thrust a sword into his side, which caused the blood and water to flow, which according to medical terminology now shows that Christ actually died of a broken heart, which caused the blood to separate. Since the Sabbath was drawing near, the Jews did not allow a man to remain on the cross on the Sabbath, and so Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate and asked that he be allowed to take Christ down from the cross, which authority was given to him. He placed Christ in his own tomb, prepared him for burial, together with Nicodemus. The tomb was closed, and soldiers were stationed there because it had been prophesied that Christ would rise from the dead. And then, as you know, Christ did rise on that Sunday morning, and this event was one of the events in history that is the most well documented. Christ first appeared to Mary in the garden. Then he appeared to the followers on the road to Emmaus. Then he appeared to Peter, and then 10 of his apostles. Thomas, remember, was not there at first. Then he appeared next to the 11, Thomas being included. Then to 40, and to many others, and to more than 400, to Paul. Then to the Nephites on the American continent, also to the 10 lost tribes, and in these latter days to Joseph Smith and others. This has been testified to by Joseph Smith and by each prophet in these latter days since that time. And I add my testimony to that Christ has raised himself from the dead. He has been resurrected. He went through this agony in Gethsemane, these trials which were illegal in nature, the scourging and the death upon the cross, to pay for our sins if we will but repent and accept that sacrifice and make it essential in our lives. And that testimony I add in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.